By autumn 1916, 2 years into the First World War, the British Army had lost over 250,000 soldiers. As more and more men were drafted into frontline duty, the vital supply lines they had manned started drying up, leaving the Allies teetering on the brink of defeat.
The British were absolutely desperate in 1916. Churchill thought that the war was likely to be lost if more manpower could not be found.
At this crucial point in the war, a distant ally sent a secret army of 140,000 men to the Western Front. That army was Chinese.
The lifeblood of war is supply, and the Chinese Labour Corps were the sinews of war, moving that lifeblood forward.
Their efforts were vital in turning potential defeat into victory, but their role has been kept secret for 100 years.
It seems such a huge chapter of history that has simply vanished.
Now, recently discovered documents, records and photographs provide startling new insight into this forgotten story and show how the Chinese were painted out of history.
We see a little figure up here. The flag is newer, the little face is older.
Well, that's a great sign.
100 years on, the British descendants of those pioneering heroes are setting out on an emotional return to the battlefields. It's a story of injustice.
Oh my God! I'm not laughing because it's funny. I can't even say it.
And sacrifice.
You couldn't turn around and say, well, actually, the contract is breached. I want to go home.
On July the 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the biggest single loss in British military history. By November, those losses had reached a staggering 500,000 men. As more and more soldiers were drafted into the battlefield from support duties behind the line, the need for workers to replace them became critical.
The British were absolutely desperate in 1916 for labour. An army doesn't just march alone. It requires enormous amounts of transport, it requires railway lines, it requires roads, building trenches, digging trenches, maintaining trenches, working on tanks, keeping them in good repair. But they had lost so many men at the Somme that there was an enormous manpower shortage. It was such that Churchill thought in 1916 that the war was likely to be lost if more manpower could not be found.
5,000 miles away, one country was ready to offer a solution. In 1916, China was still partly ruled by colonial powers, even though it had declared itself a republic 4 years earlier. Now, with its European masters at war with one another, China saw the chance to win full independence.
That's when the Chinese saw an opportunity to offer the supply of manpower. British, having got a small imperial outpost in White Highway in Shandong province, where the local people were of a stronger, bigger physique, they were the right place to recruit laborers who could actually do a lot of hard work.
China was officially neutral, so the recruitment process was shrouded in secrecy. In October 1916, the enrollment of men began in Shandong. One of the men in charge of this crucial undercover mission was a British businessman living in China, William J. Hawkins.
My grandfather never mentioned the First World War or the Chinese Labour Corps, so I knew nothing about it.
John has discovered a mysterious box hidden in a drawer of a family heirloom, and inside it, something that hasn't seen the light of day for a century.
The box of slides had stayed in this sideboard, as far as I know, pretty well since 1918, nearly 100 years, and it was a great surprise to find them. This is my grandfather standing by a large shell.
John has unearthed a historical treasure trove, a unique photographic record of Britain's secret mission to bring Chinese labourers to the Western Front.
This is a large contingent of the Chinese Labour Corps at Weihai, waiting to be embarked on a ship in the harbour.
Weihai was a British-controlled port in Shandong province. During the 19th century, China had suffered a series of humiliating military defeats and been forced to cede territory to Britain, France, Russia, Japan and Germany. Now, China was ready to support the Allies in the hope they would receive a sympathetic hearing in their bid for sovereignty. John's Mandarin-speaking grandfather was handpicked to lead the operation because of his family's distinguished reputation in China.
One doesn't normally credit the British Army with much sensitivity, but I do think in this case that there was a real effort made to try and get people who had some idea about China.
All the Chinese that were recruited had to have their fingerprints taken by Scotland Yard detectives who were sent to China, and then they had individual numbers stamped on a bracelet which they wore on their arm so that they could all be identified, because Chinese names sometimes were quite confusing to the British.
With the promise of £1 a day wages, 10 times as much as a worker could earn fishing or farming, there was no shortage of recruits for this secret Chinese army. The undercover journey from China to Britain took up to 4 months and included being locked in sealed freight trains for 2 weeks across Canada. Every available ship was used, including cargo ships, where hundreds of labourers were crammed onto vessels designed to sleep just a handful of men. Conditions were so poor that over 700 died from sickness and disease on the journey. 6 Chinese who were taken ill in transit and never made it to France are buried here in Folkestone. Actress Jing Lucy's family come from Shandong, the province in China where the 6 men and most of the other labourers came from.
My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, is from Shandong. And so when I found out about the Chinese Labour Corps, I felt if anyone should know this, I should, being a blend of British and Chinese. And I kind of wondered why I didn't know this, because I think it's such an important part of the 2 countries' shared history.
British journalist Danny Buckland has been investigating the story of the secret Chinese task force.
What strikes me weird about this is how people on the other side of the world are having to travel pretty much around the world to fight for a country that they don't have any affiliation with. Why did so many people come?
The use of Chinese labour was quite a common thing. They used to go to mines, plantations, and they had a reputation for working quite well. And because in China the economy was so poor, it didn't cost very much to actually hire a force of Chinese labourers rather than people from their own country. They worked 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, occasional holiday, but it was gruelling work.
Danny has also uncovered the location of huge secret camps where the Chinese were hidden whilst they were in Britain.
Beyond that ridge over there was where the Chinese workers actually lived for the few days they were in Folkestone.
At the time, there was a news blackout on reporting on the labourers' presence in Britain because the government didn't want the trade unions to know they were importing cheap manpower from China. Pictures of the camp only appeared in the press 50 years after the end of the war.
Something like 2,000 people would come in one day, 2,000 would go out. And from the government's point of view, they wanted as fewer people as possible to know about the Chinese being here.
The Chinese Labour Corps were not allowed to freely travel through the UK in case they were seen by dock workers and so on. They generally were carefully guarded until they could get over to France, where they took up the work that they needed to do.
One of the 140,000 labourers to be shipped over to France and Belgium was Su Yun-yi. His granddaughter Karen grew up in Cheltenham and was 8 when he died in 1980. What little she knows about his war years comes from family folklore.
He filled craters, he dodged bombs, he removed landmines. He risked his life every day. I would love to have talked to him more about it. I remember very much his strength of character. He didn't need to say much to command that respect.
Karen has come to France to meet historian Francis Wood in the town of Le Portel, where many labourers were stationed when they first arrived. Francis is showing Karen unique photographs of the labourers at work.
My grandfather was working on an airfield, I know that, but what other jobs would the Chinese labourers have been expected to do?
They worked immediately behind the battle lines with essential transportation and defence work. I mean, you can see them here sandbagging in a defensive manner. Here they're driving a wonderful traction engine, carrying goods. They dug trenches, their trench digging was said to be faster than anybody else's, so it was essential supplies to the front line.
In this rare footage, the labourers are seen celebrating Chinese New Year. One of the 3 days annual holiday they were allowed from their deadly serious mission. These recently discovered photographs show the workers handling live ammunition, and Karen has always believed that her grandfather willingly risked life and limb when he signed up. But Francis has tracked down Su Yunyi's original contract of employment, and it tells a different story.
First term, no Chinese labourer is to be employed in any sort of military operations. He's to be engaged only in industries and agriculture.
It seems a silly question, but would my grandfather have known he was going into a war zone?
No, he wouldn't have expected that. As far as he would have been concerned, this was a contract to go and work abroad. And there's nothing in this that suggests that he should have had to expect that kind of condition.
I can't imagine then the shock he must have... I mean, the shock that he must have gone through when he arrived.
The labourers were recruited as civil contractors and not military personnel, which explains why so many were prepared to come to Europe at the height of the most brutal war in history.
I think most of the labourers who signed up probably didn't have a full grasp of what they actually signed up for. The bulk of them would be illiterate. They had no idea about the war.
Great lengths were taken to keep this secret army hidden at the time. But why do the Chinese labourers still remain unknown 100 years later? New research in America may hold the answer. It seems that as Britain's forgotten army were arriving in France, they were also literally being painted out of history. In the summer of 1917, the Allies were in the middle of the largest offensive of the First World War. Known as the Battle of Passchendaele, there were 3,000 heavy guns and 65 Allied divisions involved in the fighting. This vast war machine was maintained and served by supply depots like Les Fontanettes, 50 miles behind the front line. Jing is on her way to Les Fontanettes, following in the footsteps of Kong Xiaodai, a member of the Chinese Labour Corps who came from her family's hometown in Shandong. Kong was stationed here, a member of the 140,000 Chinese task force shipped over to France in 1916 and 17. Military historian Spencer Jones has done extensive research into how the contribution of this secret army was vital to the Allied war effort.
The First World War was the world's first truly industrial war, where all the resources of a nation were mobilised, the wealth of the empire was turned towards the war effort. Supplies were plentiful and abundant. That's where the Chinese Labour Corps came in. They could handle this enormous quantity of supplies, process it and make sure it got into the hands of the fighting men at the front.
Did anything that was supplied here, did that feed any of the more famous battles we'd know of?
Chinese Labour Corps' work certainly did feed major battles, the most famous of which was the Third Battle of Ypres, fought in the Ypres salient not far from here.
The Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, saw the Allies fire 500,000 rounds of ammunition a day. It was Chinese labourers like Kong, working round the clock, 7 days a week, loading and dispatching shells, fuel and food, that kept the Allied offensive going. After 5 grueling months of attrition, both armies were still locked in a stalemate.
I'm learning now how much it takes to support a war, if that's the right term. None of those guys get any credit.
No, they don't. I think a lot of it is to do with the idolisation of the fighting man and the forgetting, if you will, of the dirty work, the unloading the bags of coal, packing the boxes of ammunition and making sure the trains run day and night. This is not a job that comes with much glory.
The Chinese also did vital work repairing and maintaining tanks and ingeniously made ramps out of brushwood, enabling them to cross 15-foot wide trenches. In a rare gesture of appreciation, Prime Minister Lloyd George later acknowledged their contribution in his memoirs. They are immensely powerful fellows, and it was no uncommon sight to see one of the Chinese pick up a bundle of corrugated iron sheets weighing 300 or 400 weight and walk off with it as calmly as if it weighed only as many stone.
It's inconceivable the British Army could have maintained its military efforts in 1917 without the work the Chinese Labour Corps was undertaking. In actual fact, in that year, the contribution of the Chinese was far more important than the American contribution.
The Americans had entered the war to great fanfare in April 1917, but initially they were slow to mobilise their troops and played a relatively small role that year. Despite this, in Paris, French artists were working to include them in a huge triumphant mural that they were making in the hope of an Allied victory. It was called the Panthéon de la Guerre, and the finished work would be the biggest painting in the world. Longer than a football pitch, it would be exhibited in a specially built circular gallery in Paris.
The Panthéon de la Guerre was kind of a who's who of the World War.
Today, the mural no longer exists in its original form, but this photograph, published in a pamphlet accompanying the exhibition, gives an idea of its scope and ambition. Art historian Mark Levitch believes that the Pantheon holds a secret, which explains why the Chinese labourers have been forgotten by history.
This is the fold-out that captures the entire painting, the Panthéon de la Guerre. It is the only rendering we have of the entire composition.
The mural featured over 5,000 figures, portraying all 23 Allied nations that participated in the war.
We start with the Italian section, then we move over here to the Belgian section. The section is labeled England.
Each country was represented by the massed ranks of its war heroes in their national costumes and uniforms.
This is the American section, and it was hastily painted in 1917.
The Americans were added as an afterthought to a virtually finished composition when they joined the war. The question is, who was sacrificed to make way for this important new ally? Mark has discovered a previously unpublished letter from one of the world's leading experts in the painting, which reveals how the Pantheon's artists made room.
When the war-weary French artists heard in 1917 that Woodrow Wilson had decided to come into the conflict, French enthusiasm was tremendous. Now, the artists set about in feverish haste to clear the extreme left-end panel that had been dedicated to the nations of the Far East. The question is there material evidence that could show that the Far Eastern allies, including the Chinese and especially the Chinese laborers, were an important part of the original painting? That's really what I'm hoping we can uncover.
The original mural no longer exists as a whole, but the American section was salvaged to form a much smaller work on display today at the National First World War Museum in Kansas. It is this American section that interests Mark.
One area I think we want to focus on is somewhere around here, the American flag. And if you can look, you see it up there.
See it up there.
Mark has enlisted the help of expert conservator Peggy DeWitt to try and find proof that the Chinese have been removed.
Would you be able to find evidence of that?
I don't know what we'll find. I need to get up there and really examine it.
Excellent.
Much closer and in more detail.
Peggy is looking for a trace of the Chinese laborers beneath the painting's surface.
Stop. Okay. Right here.
First, she uses raking light to identify areas where the original painting has been altered.
I'm looking for brush strokes that are incongruent with the rest of the painting.
Infrared allows Peggy to look for the ghosting of figures beneath the painted surface, like an X-ray. Ultraviolet light shows the different ages of paint.
I can tell you that this guy is original because he fluoresces kind of green. What we're looking for is the heads are usually a light color, so it would be little circles almost.
Then Peggy spots a mysterious figure amongst the American dignitaries.
Mark, we see a little figure up here with a cap on, and it doesn't look like a regular uniform, it looks like a cap. This figure right here.
The ultraviolet light will tell Peggy if the mysterious figure is older than the American flag.
The flag is newer, it fluoresces a little bit more purple. The little face behind here is older, it fluoresces a little bit more blue-green.
Well, that's a great sign.
It seems like the figure ran all the way behind the flag.
Has Peggy discovered evidence that Chinese laborers were in the painting before the Americans were painted over them?
The Chinese laborers were an important part of the French war effort. That's why they were included in the first place. So the question is, then, why were they removed?
Symbolically, the fact that the Chinese Labor Corps was forgotten, that they were obliterated from the Panthéon de la Guerre because China was a weak state. Not only military, but also politically, economically, they were not deemed important.
To appreciate why China was given so little credit in the history of the war, Spencer has brought Jim to the headquarters of the Chinese Labor Corps in Noyelles, northern France. He's been investigating attitudes towards the Chinese amongst the British Army officers stationed here.
The British look so formal in their military gear, and then you've got the Chinese Labour Corps. You know, they look like peasants in comparison.
Yes, that differentiation between uniforms was a key part of how the British approached the Chinese Labour Corps, to create that sense of distance between the British soldiers and officers and the labourers themselves. You have to remember that the British in some ways did regard the Chinese as a different and lesser species, as somehow childlike and backward, and they had a very, very racist view towards their lifestyle, their educational standards, and everything else about them.
Rudyard Kipling's quote, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain will meet." That's a good illustration of the attitudes of Western powers. The West is far more superior economically, philosophically, religiously. China, for instance, it's not a civilization that is at the same level.
Part of the British worldview was that Britain had a duty, a civilising mission, to actually bring what they deemed as lesser races up to a higher standard. And with this in mind, a book that was written by an officer who served with the Chinese Labour Corps was printed and produced, and it has this title.
Oh my God! I'm not laughing because it's funny. I can't. With the chinks. Who was this for?
This was written for the British public to read and get a greater appreciation of the Chinese Labour Corps, and this was the title that was chosen.
The coolie whom we trained and brought to France is a simple, jolly fellow. He is content with the very simplicities of life. He steals, but not overmuch. He is extraordinarily happy. He grins and grins. He is changing under the influence of a new vision. And there is not a coolie in France today who, when the war is over, will not go back to his country a better man for his exploits abroad.
They regarded the Chinese as a servant race that could be improved by the introduction of British culture and attitudes. It would improve them as individuals, and they could take this idea back to China. It's that racist vision again.
Our children, a paternal attitude towards the coolies recommended, are passionately fond of playing the fool. They are a race of Peter Pans, never having grown up. Nightly, I thank God they are not going to be soldiers. Never a man would reach the trenches alive. Wow. I just don't know on what basis they've conformed these very strong ideas about their ability as humans. And this term coolie, what does that mean?
Coolie means indentured servant, somebody who's working not for a wage or for normal living conditions, but he's actually indentured to their employer. It was a derogatory phrase. It was not a phrase that would ever be applied to a European worker. It was reserved solely for applying to Chinese workers.
I think I'm mostly disappointed at how the British have behaved. I can't quite get my head round that the Chinese came over to help, and this is how they are rewarded. They're called all these derogatory names. British have written a book about them with a horrific title, and that's such an evocative racial slur in the title, in capitals. If we're talking about the N-word, that would definitely not be acceptable.
In August 1917, China gave up its neutral status, and the labourers became fully fledged allies. But life was going to get more difficult still for the Chinese, who were about to feel the full force of British military discipline. On March the 21st, 1918, the German Air Force began bombarding Allied airfields across northern France as part of its spring offensive to try and bring about a swift German victory. Germany redeployed 500,000 troops onto the Western Front as they advanced deep into Allied territory. At its most intense, German shells rained down at a rate of 3,000 every minute, and the Chinese workers, including Karen's grandfather, Su Yunyi, now found themselves directly in the line of fire. Su was responsible for repairing damaged runways, and Francis has brought Karen to the RAF airbase in St. Omer to show her what her grandfather's working conditions were like.
That's my grandfather. My grandfather told my father that the time he was most frightened was when he was ordered to go onto the airfield and fill in bomb craters whilst the German planes were bombing, because the Allied planes were due to land at any moment.
I mean, this would actually qualify as military activity, or certainly, you know, he was in considerable danger from military activity, and it's very much contrary to the first clause in the contract that he signed.
We had come here to work. It goes without saying that we were terror-stricken. Back in China, I had never seen such a thing. The millions of common people who, behind the front, perform all kinds of tasks, who are of importance to the war. They do not enter the battlefield, but are barely different from those who do. Frightening. Terrifying.
He didn't have a choice. He couldn't turn around and say, well, actually, the contract is breached. I want to go home, you know. It breaks my heart to think how far he was away from home, how much he must have missed his family. You know, 19 years old, just a child, really. I mean, I can't imagine what the reality was like, but I'm getting an idea of it now, and it just... I have a lot of respect for him and what he went through, you know, for our family to be here.
The labourers' contract specified that because they were employed as civilians and not military personnel, they were to work in a safe zone at least 10 miles behind the front line. But by April 1918, German shelling and bombardment had escalated to the point where nowhere was safe from attack. Jing has come to the In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres to meet historian Dominic Den Dorven, who's been looking into what happened to a compatriot, Kong Xiaodai. As the war spread beyond the front line, the supply depot at Les Fontanettes, where Kong was stationed, became a prime target for German planes.
Here is Les Fontanettes. Each red dot is where bombs were dropped, and
That's
the
where
canal
we were. That's exactly where we were.
Was heavily bombed by German airplanes.
In July 1918, the Allies launched a massive counter-offensive. With victory or defeat hanging in the balance, tensions within the Allied camp were at breaking point, and conflicts flared up between the Chinese and the British.
If we look at this Father von Wallegem was a local priest, and this is his original manuscript of his diary.
Wow.
And he mentions the Chinese...
This is original?
Oh, this is original, yes. Yes, indeed.
In some of the Chinese camps, there are angry protests which have begun to turn ugly. Yesterday, they stabbed an English captain. Today, there were 30 of them at Boosboom who refused to work and lay down on the grounds to be beaten. I passed the camp at Verheer's place and saw 3 of them with their arms outstretched and tied to the wire, and one with his leg tied to it. That can't be pleasant in this weather, because it's well below freezing today. It's just so sad that it's come to this point, you know, between essentially comrades that are fighting for one team, you know, and they're doing this to each other.
Yes, and I think that it is due that the British never really saw the Chinese as their allies.
Yeah.
And they just looked upon them as subordinates. The majority of officers saw the Chinese as an inferior race who would only work when they are properly flogged. That was considered the way you treat these kind of people.
By autumn 1918, the Allied counteroffensive, supported by a network of Chinese labour, had prevailed. Unable to maintain its territorial gains, by winter, the isolated German army was demoralised and beaten. Armistice Day, November the 11th, 1918, and the war finally ends. There is jubilation around the world as the Allied troops prepare to leave. But not the Chinese, who had signed a 3-year contract with the British and now had to clear up the mess.
I think the worst of their work, in fact, came after Armistice Day, because they were then set to clearing battlefields of spent armaments, many of which were still live, and also gather up bones and bodies for burial. It would be a task that would be repellent and depressing for anyone. It is at that time that you do get more refusal to undertake tasks, I mean, sort of trying to go on strike and so on.
Jing's compatriot from Shandong, Kong Xiaodai, was one of the labourers contracted by the British. Dominic has been investigating Kong's military records and has brought Jing to Les Baraques military cemetery near Calais to show her what became of him.
Oh, this is him! Kong Xiaodai.
But he's not the only one, because if you look to the 3 others next to him, they have the same date. There was a riot. The Chinese rioted that day. And in order to quell the riots, the British sent a group of guards, and they just shot in the lot.
They were just shot?
Yeah, they were just shot.
The British just shot them?
Yeah. So without court-martial or anything, they just shot to quell the unrest.
So they were killed by their own employers? Oh, God. Oh, God. What a awful way to end your life. You've travelled all the way around the world, you've escaped dying en route because you were treated like a cattle, and you do the worst, shittiest jobs anyone can think of, and you're punished for over the smallest things. You're not even fed properly, and when you really try to stick up for yourself because you just can't take any more, you are shot in the street like that, like a dog.
No official inquest was ordered into the 4 Chinese who were shot. Their plight only came to light because a Canadian also died in the crossfire, prompting an inquiry into his death.
If it wasn't for a Canadian that was accidentally killed, we wouldn't have known about the fate of these 4. The Canadian was clearly deemed more valuable. And the Canadian was also a labourer. He was in the Army Service Corps.
Oh, he was doing the same thing as these guys?
More or less, yeah, more or less. Yeah.
But he's Canadian.
But he's Canadian. He's white. He's a European.
He's worth way more. He's worth all of these guys times 100. Oh, wow, that is not how I expected the story to end. Faithful until death.
No one is exactly sure how many Chinese labourers were killed on the Western Front. Estimates vary from 5,000 to 10,000. 841 Chinese are buried in this cemetery in Noyelles, northern France. As with all the Allied fallen, it was down to Chinese workers like Karen's grandfather to bury the dead.
I just feel very moved being here, feeling that I'm walking on the same earth that he's walked on, imagining him at the airfield and imagining him burying his fellow countrymen here. It's quite an emotional thing. It's very moving. I feel like, you know, he's looking down on me. Oh dear, here we go. I feel very proud of him, and I feel very grateful to him and others like him, because if it weren't for him and others like him, we wouldn't be living in the free, liberal, democratic world that we live in today. And we're very lucky to be living in that world, in this world. So we owe him everything, really.
By the beginning of 1919, the war was over. But now a new twist was about to unfold as China and the Western Allies squared up for a bitter diplomatic showdown. In January 1919, the Allied nations convened at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris to begin peace negotiations to end the First World War. Far from the global power it is today, China was then a fledgling republic, trying to shake off a century of humiliation at the hands of European nations that occupied large areas of the country.
The fact that China was included in the Versailles Peace Conference was a big deal for the Chinese, because for the first time, China would be sitting with the great powers, the Allies, Britain, France, the United States, as a kind of an equal. These were big deals. It would be a turning point for China. Now, what they in reality would be wanting to get would be the return of the German concessions in Shandong and all the German privileges to China.
But instead of returning the German territories to China, the Allies handed over control to another colonial power, China's archenemy, Japan.
One of the saddest things about China in the First World War is France and Britain and Russia had signed secret treaties to let Japan take over Shandong, take over the ex-German colonies, keep them in return for providing shipping to help with the war effort. So, I mean, China needn't have bothered to become an ally. China had, in fact, no hope of gaining anything at Versailles because of the secret treaties.
It is not too strong to state that China was betrayed by its allies. Political reason why the Chinese Labour Corps was sent was to give China a voice in the peace negotiations with the ultimate aim at recovering sovereignty. And that humiliation had huge repercussions in China and how the Chinese saw themselves and how the Chinese looked upon the Western powers.
The double cross at Versailles led to huge demonstrations throughout China. The government collapsed, and in the political vacuum that followed, the Chinese Communist Party was formed under Mao Zedong, setting China on a radically different path from the Western democracies that had betrayed her.
It is an absolutely pivotal moment in Chinese history. It's a terribly important moment because it really starts the 20th century for China, and indeed the 21st century. It starts modern China.
As the Chinese delegation walked out of the Versailles negotiations empty-handed, elsewhere in Paris, millions were celebrating the Allied victory by marveling at the pantheon of war heroes depicted on the largest painting ever made. The vast mural no longer exists, but enhanced photographs of the painting taken at the time show how it would have looked when it was first exhibited in 1919. Art historian Mark Levitch believes that a group of Chinese laborers were unceremoniously painted out to make way for the United States when they entered the war. But on closer inspection of the 5,000 figures in the original painting, Mark has spotted a lone Chinese laborer crouching at the feet of the Americans.
So this is the hastily painted American section from 1917 that they painted over the Far Eastern Allies. And you can see over here in the corner the sole token Chinese laborer who's pictured seated.
The American section of the Pantheon is on display today at the National First World War Museum in Kansas. It had been damaged but was restored and edited in 1959 by Kansas artist Daniel McMorris. Mysteriously, the token Chinese laborer sitting on the steps by the US flag has vanished too, leaving Mark with another puzzle.
I know that he was cut out of the edited painting, but if there's evidence of where that fragment went and sort of how the decision was made to get rid of it, that would be great.
Mark has tracked down the last surviving member of McMorris's original team of assistants, Jack Cox, to try and find out what happened.
Hey, Jack, nice to see you. These are random shots that I did by the small Polaroid camera.
So these are Polaroids that you took?
Polaroids that I took.
At his studio?
At his studio.
As you guys were working on it.
Right.
This one is particularly interesting to me because it seems to show that the Chinese laborer, who we see here in the original,
has been painted out.
Painted out, right there. So this was an area that you worked on?
Yes. I worked on the steps down there, getting that clear for whatever he was going to put there.
Okay. Some of the figures were moved over here.
Yeah.
But this guy, who was on the steps, does not reappear. So we're sort of trying to figure out, you know, why he
took him out.
Why he took him out, yeah. Did he tell you sort of cut out this piece?
No, I did none of. I had no part of that at all.
Had no part
Mine
of
was
the
all
cutting?
painting.
I see.
I would just simply ask him, "What portion do you want me to work on today?" And I'm sure, or maybe I shouldn't say this, that he didn't consider the Chinese laborers all that important to the entire picture. I remember working a lot on those steps.
Yeah.
So I probably was painting him out.
I think the Pantheon de la Guerre, in many respects, is a prism for seeing how an entire group of people who participated in the war have been erased from history. And even have that one token laborer removed. This is the perfect metaphor for understanding the Western perception of Chinese participation in World War I.
But the Chinese laborers have not been completely forgotten. Now they are being celebrated with an exhibition and tribute in the heart of London's Chinatown.
The Chinese Labour Corps made a significant contribution to the Allied effort. And just because they were labourers does not mean that we should diminish their worth. This is the time to give them official recognition.
The event at the China Exchange is to raise funds for a campaign to erect a public memorial to the labourers in Britain, a cause that has drawn the support of some well-known figures.
Now is the time to say, we now recognise for the first time, as if some huge curtain has been pulled aside, and we can see what these people did, contributed to our freedom, our welfare, our safety, our way of life today.
Today, there are 60,000 World War I memorials in Britain, representing 21 different nations. But not one mentions the contribution of the 140,000-strong Chinese task force.
Nobody thought to commemorate them in the way that almost everybody else who worked in the war has been commemorated.
Labour Corps historian Francis Wood is also supporting the ambitious plan to build a huge permanent memorial in central London.
The idea is to put up a huabiao.
Huabiao.
These huabiao, you can see them in front of the Forbidden City in Peking, and they used to stand in front of all government buildings for about 2,000 years in China. They're kind of places where proclamations were posted. They're notice boards, but very beautiful because amazingly carved, with the top of the column is pierced by a cloud floating through it. And the idea is to try and create a memorial like this in honour of the
Let's
Chinese
do it
Labour
now.
Corps.
I love that. I absolutely adore that. Huabiao.
Whilst the public memorial awaits planning permission, a plaque dedicated to the labourers in this, their centenary year, is to be unveiled at the China Exchange as the final wish of its founder, the late Sir David Tang.
The last email that David sent to me was to encourage China Exchange's support for the Chinese Labour Corps campaign. Today, we'll unveil a plaque that will be displayed here to ensure that all of our visitors are aware of the contribution of the Chinese Labour Corps.
It's so important, this shared history which brings us together and says that, you know, we have more in common than you would think.
To say to China, you lent us 140,000 of your strong men. We thank you for that. We remember them.
It will be an important first step to righting that wrong of history.
Karen and her father Frank have been invited as guests of honour to unveil the plaque. The first ever commemoration in this country of Britain's forgotten army.
This is a real significant moment, I think, because it's the first time that it's publicly been acknowledged, and my grandfather and for all the others, we're very grateful.
On Remembrance Sunday in the past, it's always been something quite distant, whereas now I feel connected. It really feels personal for me. I feel very much part of British history now in a way that I didn't before. I only wish my grandfather could have seen it today. I think he would feel very proud that his work had been acknowledged, because he would have seen things and done things with all of his fellow Chinese Labour Corps that deserve recognition.
Later tonight at 9, restoring the four faces around Big Ben, the painstaking work to save the world's most famous clock. On the way next this evening, a portrait of the Queen in the country, from corgis to cattle, a monarch and her favourite animals.